When we think back on different game console generations, we may think about the different revisions that happened during that time. So, for example, with the PlayStation 4, if I would ask you which PlayStation 4 systems came out in that time, you would think about the original PlayStation 4 launch, the PlayStation 4 Slim, and then the PlayStation 4 Pro. However, something that I find fascinating with these different companies is they have what you would call, quote unquote, silent or quiet revisions. These are ones where they try to change things up internally, usually to reduce costs, and in this case, even work to develop towards a PlayStation 4 Pro. And in order to do that, Sony released a PlayStation 4 variation in 2015, right between the PS4 launch and the PS4 Pro. Today, I want to take a look at that one with the model number CUH 1200 and how it started to at least set things up for Sony's venture into the 4K era with the PS4 Pro. This PS4 showed up summer of 2015, roughly a year and a half after the PS4 originally launched. While Sony was still just over a year away from releasing their PS4 Pro, this model did incorporate a few changes that would make their way into that 4K system. While these changes obviously didn't include any sort of visual upgrade, it wasn't really advertised that way. In fact, it was barely advertised at all outside of the general PS4 marketing, and that does make sense as it'd be more known as a quiet revision, this being a new model that isn't different enough to be seen as a new release and usually favor the manufacturer with lower costs from revised parts. Also, real quick, since I did get a DualShock 4 with this used PS4, how does everyone feel about the last-gen Sony controller at this point? Going back to it from the DualSense controller, it does feel better than I remember. The curves aren't as subtle as the DualSense controller, but holding it now, it does, I think, fit a bit better in the hand. This particular controller looks like it's seen better days, but the DualShock 4, I think, holds up well to this day, and I tend to use one for emulation on mini PCs or even on my PS2 with an adapter. Anyway, back to the PS4, which does have some pretty obvious differences right away on the outside. The normally glossy side panel that covers the hard drive has been replaced with a matte black finish. I was never a fan of this glossy plastic era that we went through in the 2010s that all these companies decided to adopt, so this is only an improvement in my mind. It just looks a lot cleaner since the glossy plastic would normally just be covered in scratches, especially on a used console like this one. The other big change were the power and eject buttons. At launch, the PS4 had these touch panels for powering on the system and ejecting the disc. Sony decided to change these out for tactile buttons. The touch panels weren't exactly accurate and would either be too responsive and lead to you double tapping either button or not responsive at all to where the system just wouldn't turn on anymore. I think Sony wanted the sleek look with their original PS4 design using those touch buttons to sort of blend in, but the lack of functionality just wasn't worth that trade-off. Those are the two main changes from the outside, so we'll start tearing it down from here. I picked this system up a little while ago, used thinking I could have a PS4 ready as more and more homebrew efforts happen. I figure giving the system a quick teardown, cleaning, and thermal compound change isn't a bad idea. The casing comes apart similar to the original PS4 model with the cover sliding to the side, giving us access to the hard drive. This has a 500 gigabyte drive installed, and I'm thinking about dropping an SSD in, but the only real benefit for the PS4 is the random seeking would be faster. The PS4 uses an older SATA type, limiting the speeds of solid-state drives, making this a slight upgrade, unfortunately. Still, a 1 terabyte SSD isn't overly expensive considering I wouldn't be looking for a top-of-the-line fast drive, so it might be worth doing, especially if the homebrew scene takes off. Sony does still have their special screw that has the PlayStation symbol stamped around the edges, holding the hard drive in place. There are 2 screws on the back by the vents that frees up the right plastic panel, along with the bottom panel. A quick look at the top, you can start to see some of the changes to the chassis. Notice these depressions around where the heatsink clamp is. We'll be coming back to those soon. I do have to remove the power supply from the other side to start freeing up the different ribbon cables from the Blu-ray drive, along with the Wi-Fi antenna. You can see how Sony worked to move air through the power supply in the back with this open design right behind the heatsink, which does sit right behind the fan. While we're on the topic of the Blu-ray drive, here's a change that Sony made that makes the swap way easier. They got rid of the daughter board. Typically with most of the consoles, you have a main board and then a board for the disk drive. Generally, these are unique and paired to the main motherboard, and if it gets lost or damaged, That's it. You can't use a disk drive at all with that system. In this case, Sony seems to have integrated that daughter board to the main board, so you just plug the disk drive in and it works. This is something that would make its way into the PS4 Pro, as that would not ship with a drive daughter board either. Oh, and while the power button is on the main board, the eject button was moved to its own board that connects through a ribbon cable. In the previous model, this was on the daughter board for the Blu-ray drive, but here, it's on this sort of floating board design. I think they did this so when the bottom casing is put on, it's able to move into place and line up easier. Either way, this is a good change considering this board is easily replaceable and is not tied to the motherboard, so if you have a broken eject button on this model, it ends up being a very easy repair. With all the cables unplugged, it's a process of removing a bunch of Torx screws and different sized Phillips head screws. I wasn't a fan of Sony's move away from a simpler layout inside with the older model. This one just seems to have these different sized Phillips head screws seemingly at random placed around it. This is a system I would recommend taking some pictures before removing any screws so you don't forget the order they go in. The metal panel comes off, and those depressions that I mentioned earlier have a pretty important function. It actually works to cool the RAM. This is a change that would make its way into that PS4 Pro, with the RAM being concentrated to one side of the board opposite of the APU. The original PS4 model had 16 RAM chips to reach the 8GB mark, whereas this one has 8 chips. This is probably the most obvious place to save money since the entire board and cooling was revised around this particular change, but also they used 8 less chips to get the same result. Most likely Sony was able to source more affordable 1GB RAM chips at this time and worked it into the design. The motherboard itself is a fair amount smaller, especially when we put it up here side by side with the older PS4 motherboard, and when removed, we can see the PS4 APU marked CXD90037G. Don't get too excited though, it's still the same 28nm design from the original model, and wouldn't be until the slim PS4 release that we would see the move to 16nm, so there's really not much to see here. The heatsink is just a few screws away with the fan. This is generally where all of the dust ends up collecting, and it looks like I have a few dust bunnies in here. The heatsink did see a bit of a downsize and is probably the main source, along with the shrunken motherboard, for the weight reduction that was reported at the time. I saw concerns around the PS5 heatsink shrinking when that news broke recently, and it makes sense that that would be the first thought for something like this, but in this case, Sony seemed to revise power draw along with the RAM chips being removed from around the APU, and using the thicker chassis on the opposite side to cool things appears to make this heatsink size work. I don't have exact temperature readings for this model versus the older one, but it could be something to look at in the future with a couple of hacked systems that can give us accurate temperature readings from the system level. Looking over this PS4, it's actually not in bad shape and wasn't even that dirty. I mostly just had to hit it with some compressed air and pull a few small wads of dust out here and there, and it seems to be good to go. I did clean the APU off and applied new MX4 compound. These PlayStation 4 consoles can be fairly quiet, all things considered, if the airway just isn't blocked. Most of the time, a loud PS4 like this is just dusty and needs to be cleaned. Just keep in mind, you may need to go down to the heatsink and fan level if it has a lot of dust buildup. At this point, the main cleaning I was looking to do is done, and the system just needs to go back together. If it wasn't for the physical buttons and change in the glossy top, this would have been a largely unnoticed revision for the PS4. It still runs games the same way and keeps the same form factor, but the changes inside are fairly substantial for how Sony was working to refine the design of their console. The PS4 Pro released a little more than a year later, complete with physical buttons for power and eject, the RAM being concentrated to 8 chips on the opposite side of the APU, and no daughter board, and not a piece of glossy plastic in sight. That's the thing that can be so interesting about a revision like this. It works to show us the process as Sony figured out changes in manufacturing and design even for future projects. Unfortunately, this PS4 that I have is on a higher firmware than what the homebrew community is currently tackling, but I'll leave it offline just in case they're able to crack it in the future. Let me know in the comments if you had this specific PS4 console with the physical buttons, or if this was the first time seeing it. What do you think? Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.